invite you to open up your Bibles to First Chronicles. First Chronicles is where we're going to be spending most of our time in our lesson this morning, our first lesson. When we study through the Bible, back home, one of the things that we do is we take a chronological study through the Bible very often. So we start in Genesis and we're just going through the narrative. You know, we start with the creation story. We go on through the flood and the patriarchs and so forth. And when we come to the United Kingdom, and particularly to the reign of David in 2 Samuel, as it starts telling the story of David's reign, we start to pick up more information from 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And as we do that, we're adding in details. It's sort of like taking all four Gospels together. You know, you get a few details from each of the four Gospels, and then you put those together to get as complete a picture as we can of the life and ministry of Jesus. We do a similar thing with 1st and 2nd Chronicles. We say, okay, it tells us a little bit more about this detail. And so particularly when David starts preparing for the temple, get a lot of details from 1st Chronicles. When Solomon goes to build the temple, so as we open up 1st Kings, Solomon starts to build the temple, get a lot of information from 1st Chronicles and even over into 2nd Chronicles. And then when the kingdom divides, we get more additional information, and particularly as it refers to the southern kingdom of Judah, the two tribes there in the south. 2nd Chronicles helps us fill in gaps along the way. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles end up kind of being used as reference material, appendix material, to 2 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, what I want to look at in the lesson this morning is to show that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are much more than mere reference material. Over in 1 Chronicles chapter 17 and in verse 10, 1 Chronicles 17 and verse 10, it says, "Even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people, I will subdue all your enemies. Moreover, I tell you that the Lord will build a house for you." That building of the house, in fact, the rebuilding of the house, I think is going to be an important element as we go through 1st Chronicles. And I think it's going to point to a restoration that Israel, that Judah, the kingdom of Judah, is engaged in during this time. Okay. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the book of 1st Chronicles. 1st Chronicles chapter 1 begins this way. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, as you read those names in the first 4 verses of 1st Chronicles, you likely recognize some of them at least. Surely you recognize Adam and perhaps Enoch, Methuselah. I'm sure you recognize the names Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth if you're familiar with the book of Genesis. But this begins 9 chapters of names pretty well laid out like this. And they're not 9 short chapters. All but 2 of the chapters are 40 or more verses. There's one chapter where there's 80 verses of names and multiple names per verse. And so that's a lot of names to read through. As we were talking about the other day, when you're doing your Bible reading, you get to 1st Chronicles chapter 1 and you look down, you think, whoa, well this maybe this won't take so long, and then you get to the next chapter and the next chapter and you're thinking, are we ever going to get out of these names? I'll tell you one thing as we look at those genealogies. I just want to say right off the bat, I think every word of God is important. I think they're all valuable. Even 1st Chronicles chapter 1 through 9. I think all these names are valuable. One of the things that I think about that is that these names, these first 9 chapters, are preserved for us when other things were not. We're told, for instance, that that the historians in the Old Testament, that they used materials to compile their documents. Ezra talks about this. He says, I looked into the histories, and I've looked in to compile his record. When we look at the book of Ezra, he's telling us, I've investigated to compile my record. And some of the records he mentions are books we don't have. And you say, why weren't those preserved for us? Well, they're not needed. Solomon, we're told he wrote over 1,000 songs. Only one of them is saved for us. Now, I'd like to read the other songs. I don't know about you. And I would say this. I'm certain I would rather read those than 9 chapters of names. But God knows better than me. And he preserved what he thought was necessary. And his wisdom is far greater than mine. And if he's preserved 9 chapters of names, I not just assume, but I believe that these are more important than those 999 songs of Solomon that were not preserved. And I want to know what I can learn. I will say this at the front end. If nothing else, if you don't get anything else from those 9 chapters, get this. The genealogies in general, 9 chapters in particular, shows very strongly that these stories are rooted in actual history. You don't get 9 chapters of genealogies in a mythology. You don't get 9 chapters of genealogy in a fairy tale. If you tried, no one would read that fairy tale. But that is what you get when people are telling actual history. These are real people, and it takes us all the way down through and shows us where everybody comes through that connects it to reality. So if somebody wants to dismiss this as mythology, they've got to deal with 9 chapters of names that suggest otherwise. I think that's at least one important point to make. Well, we'll come back and make some other important points in a few moments. But continuing on, as you're just looking at the overview of 1 Chronicles in particular, you open up chapter 10. And chapter 10 through 12 tells us about David ascending to the throne. I think that particularly helps us think about the purpose of the book, because it doesn't tell us about the reign of Saul. It does mention Saul, but only very briefly. Right there at the beginning of chapter 10, it tells us the Philistines fought against Israel. The men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines closely pursued Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle became heavy against Saul, and the archers overtook him, and he was wounded by the archers. And it goes on to tell us that he died, and then in verse 6, he died with his 3 sons, and all those of his house died. Then it tells us that David ascends to the throne. It tells us a little bit about the men of Jabesh Gilead, but chapter 11 then turns our attention to David. So, in the narrative, most of 1 Samuel is talking about the reign of Saul. Here, not even a full chapter is devoted. And really, that chapter is not devoted to the reign of Saul. It's devoted to the fall of Saul. And it moves so quickly to the reign of David. So, whoever's writing 1 Chronicles, they're not interested in telling you about Saul. They're interested in telling you about David. And that's important. Well, it tells us about him coming to the throne. And by the time we get into chapter 12, we've established him on the throne. And then we come to chapter 13, and we have 4 chapters that are about moving the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, about the mistakes that are committed in the moving of the ark. And maybe you remember that story with Uzzah, where David began to move the ark not in the way it was prescribed. Uzzah reaches out and touches the ark, and he is struck dead. That's all here in 1 Chronicles chapter 13 through 16. And then, of course, David learns from that lesson, and he moves the ark in the way that God has prescribed and brings it into Jerusalem, and so establishes its place there. That's a lot of chapters. In kind of an overview fashion where lots of things are being left out. We're only including a few details about David's reign. To give 4 chapters to basically one event, that's important. You should say, why is the moving of the ark so important to the person who's writing 1 Chronicles? You pick up in chapter 17, and it focuses on the reign of King David. And again, we notice what's included, but we notice what's not included. Maybe one of the most pivotal events in David's life is his sin with Bathsheba. After the sin with Bathsheba, everything changes. And David's reign and his life kind of begins to spiral out of order. His son betrays him. Absalom raises up a support to overthrow David's throne. And he has to even flee Jerusalem and then come back and sort of retake the capital, killing his own son, or at least his military leader killed his own son. None of that is in 1 Chronicles. You don't hear about the sin with Bathsheba. You don't hear about the rise of Absalom. It's completely absent. Why would he leave out such an important moment in David's life? Tell you what he does tell us about. He tells us about David saying, I want to build a temple for the Lord. And about God saying to David, you will not build the temple for me, but I will build a house for you. You won't build me a house, but I'll build you a house. And then we're told about David making preparations for that temple. All the things, lots of details that he set in place to prepare for his son to build the temple. And so in verse 20 or chapter 22, that's what we pick up with there. Both the preparation for the temple and all the things that were set in place by David and then were implemented by Solomon. And then we get into the 2 Chronicles, and Solomon begins to construct the temple, and we see that at the beginning of 2 Chronicles. Well, that gives us a picture of what 1 Chronicles is about. So what is it we're focused on? We're focusing on David. And we're focusing on particular elements of David's reign. There are some failures mentioned, the moving of the ark, but there's other failures that are left out. We're focusing certainly, beginning in chapter 22, so the subject we deal with most in the book is preparation for the temple. How does that help us understand what this book is about? Well, and I didn't pull up the PowerPoint here as we were going along, but let's move on to the next element here that I think is going to be helpful is when was this book written? All right, so we see what it's about, we see what it's focusing on, but when is it written? Well, go back to chapter 3, in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. We get a time marker here, chapter 3 and verse 19. There it says, the sons of Pedaiah were Zerubbabel and Shimei, and the sons of Zerubbabel were Meshullam and Hananiah, and Shelomith was their sister. And it goes on to give us some more names. All right. Who is Zerubbabel? Well, if you're looking at the history of Israel, you know that after the kingdom divided, the northern kingdom was taken away by Assyria. Now that would have, 722 is when the kingdom divided, and then later the northern kingdom is taken away by Assyria and during the reign of Hezekiah in the southern kingdom. That's about the time Isaiah is being written. All right, the northern kingdom is being taken away. The southern kingdom goes on for a while longer, several more generations, and we have some declines. We have one more rise with King Josiah, and then it's all bad from there. And beginning in the time of Daniel, the southern kingdom begins to be taken away by Babylon. Now, maybe you remember that. They're taken away into captivity. So you have Daniel in the first wave being taken away into captivity, into Babylon. In the second wave, you have Ezekiel being taken away into captivity to Babylon, and he's there by the river Kibar. And in the third wave, you have basically the rest who are taken away, and Jerusalem is destroyed. And Jeremiah is who tells us about that final destruction, that final wave of captivity. Well, about 70 years from the time Daniel was taken away into captivity, we're told that the people would come back. And towards the end of Daniel's life, the Medo-Persian Empire comes and takes over the Babylonian Empire. And one of the first things Cyrus does is tells all the captives that they can go back and rebuild wherever they're from. And for our purposes, particularly, that includes that includes the children of Israel. So, 2 men lead that return from Babylon back to Israel. We're told about this in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so it starts in Ezra. And just as there are 3 waves being taken away into captivity, there's going to be 3 waves going back to rebuild. The first wave is led by 2 men, Zerubbabel, that's who we just read about here in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19. Zerubbabel and Jeshua. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But what 1 Chronicles chapter 3 and verse 19 tells us, that whoever is writing 1 Chronicles is writing after Zerubbabel's lived, or at least while he's living, because he mentions him in the genealogies. So whenever this was written, it's got to be written at the time of the return, or even after the time of the return. One of the difficulties when we're reading something, we're thinking about it like we're reading about David. We go, okay, so somebody, David or one of his family wrote this. No, this is many years removed that they're looking back and they're writing the history of Israel. And that history is being written at a time where we know it goes all the way through the time of Zerubbabel. Another element is that 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written all as one book. They're divided up for us just kind of for convenience sake, to make it more manageable. But in the original documents, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it's all one book. It's just called the Chronicles. And actually it's called something else other than that. The Latin word that gets attached to it is basically the Chronicles. But it's just the histories of the kings of Israel. And so we know that whoever wrote 1st Chronicles wrote 2nd Chronicles at the same time. It's all one book. And so that also tells us that it comes at the time, at least of the captivity, because that's where we leave off in 2nd Chronicles chapter 36. Actually, where we leave off in the last couple of verses is we get all the way to Cyrus sending the people back. So in 2nd Chronicles 36, and looking there in verse 23. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up. Now, turn one page over to the book of Ezra. It's the very next book in your Bible. And you see there, now in the 1st year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdoms and put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kings of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And so whoever there is among all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. So what you see is that the very opening words of Ezra overlap the final words of the book of 2nd Chronicles. That seems to suggest like Luke and Acts overlapping. And of course being written to the same person suggests that Luke wrote both of those. I think Ezra probably wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles and then follows it up with Ezra. Ezra's a continuing history of where 2nd Chronicles leaves off. Now, why is any of that important? Not every book is it critical to know when it was written in order to understand. I think there's things you can understand in 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, without knowing when it was written. But when you know that it is written during the time of Ezra, who goes in the second wave to go back to Jerusalem, then it helps us understand maybe why it's written. All right, so when Zerubbabel and Jeshua go back in order to rebuild, they go back to rebuild the temple. And they lay its foundation, and then they leave off a little bit. And some prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, show up and tell Zerubbabel and the people, Haggai especially says, why are you living in paneled houses while the Lord's house lies in ruin? They have to be reinvigorated to the work. And so they do that. All right, they get the temple built. Ezra comes back, and he comes to reestablish the worship of the temple. So the first wave is to build the temple. The second wave is to reestablish the worship around the temple, which includes all of those things that David and Solomon set in order that we read about in 1 Chronicles. And then, of course, the third wave is Nehemiah, and he comes back to complete the wall around the city, kind of finish the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. So that's the 3 waves of return. All right. So understanding that helps us understand that maybe what Ezra is doing is he's recording the history that Israel needs to know in order to accomplish the job that he's going back to do. They need to know about King David, because it's the city of David. This city of Jerusalem, that's David's capital city that they're going to rebuild. They need to know about the temple. They need to know how to reconstruct it and how to set up the worship that surrounds that, and on and on. And we'll come back to that point a little bit more in just a few moments. All right. Well, then let's go back once again. I know we're about to go through the genealogies. We're about to reference them for the second or maybe third time now. But I want to see what they could learn from those genealogies. As you go back there, once more, 1 Chronicles chapter 1. We start with those names that we read before. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, when I say Adam, and maybe even Seth, where does your mind go? Well, I hope it goes to Genesis 1, because that's where we find Adam. And Genesis 2, of course, as well. But as you hear those names, if I were to say, now I don't know that this will have the same effect for you. I'm an American. And if I were to say to American people, if I were to bring up names of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, people would instantly think of the beginnings of our country. Now, I wouldn't have to say to Americans, here's what George Washington did. They already know, right? I've already told them what I'm talking about by just giving them the names. I think in 1 Chronicles, what he's doing is reattaching them to their stories. He's going all the way back to the beginning. Let me start over. Let me tell our story again, but I'm going to do it in abbreviated fashion. I'm just going to start here. I'm going to say Adam, Seth, Enosh, and their minds would be reconnected. Here's where our story starts. It starts in Genesis 1. It starts at the creation. And he takes them down through Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. That's the 3 sons of Noah. And you'll notice as he picks up in verse 5, he starts talking about the genealogies of each of the sons of Noah, just like we have back in Genesis chapter 10. That's what Genesis 10 does. It tells us the people of Japheth. It tells us the people of Ham. And it tells us then the people of Shem. He does the same thing here. But just like Genesis chapter 10, once he gets to Shem, we're not concerned about Japheth and Ham anymore. Why not? Well, that's not God's chosen people. If you're a Jew, that's not your story, right? So, yes, I'm going to tell you, just like Genesis told you, the story of Noah's sons, of Japheth and of Ham, but they are Shem's people. Incidentally, that's where the word Semitic comes from. We talk about Semitic people. They're Shemitic people. They come from Shem. So it would include the Jews as well as these various other nations that come down through them. But we focus our attention not just on Shem, which is given a lengthier genealogy than the other 2 brothers, but we then now narrow down to Abraham. We're not concerned about all the sons of Shem. We're concerned about one son of Shem, Abraham. And so we focus our attention on him beginning in verse 28. These are the sons of Abraham. And they were Isaac and Ishmael. He gives us the genealogy of Ishmael. Then he sets Ishmael to the side, because that's not where we're going. We want to know about Isaac. And so he goes and he tells us about Isaac. And then he tells us of the sons of Isaac, who are Esau and Jacob. And he gives us the genealogy of Esau, and who becomes the nation of Edom. And then he sets them aside because we're not concerned about Esau. We want to know about Isaac. Do you see what he's doing as he comes down through here? He's giving them the history of the world, of creation. And he's showing them there's all these people, but they're not chosen. You are. They get set aside and set aside and set aside, and look at all these people who are the not chosen, while here you are rising above the rest, being God's chosen. God continually focuses his attention on his people. So beginning in chapter 2, we get the focus on the sons of Jacob, who are the 12 tribes of Israel. As we do that, there are two particular areas of focus. One is the house of David. Why are we concerned about that? Well, in David, a particular promise that did not apply to all the tribes, or even all of the tribe of Judah, that was applied just to David, that I will establish your throne forever. Now that's going to be a hard lesson, a hard promise for the people to swallow when the throne of David has been destroyed. There's not one stone left upon another, but God said he would establish it forever. And here the chronicler is going back and he is giving us the genealogy of David, and as he takes us through that, he shows us that God maintained that on the throne all the way up to the destruction. And guess what? The genealogy of David is still alive. It's not over. Now, they might feel like it's over, but I think this genealogy is convincing them it's not over. He can still be set back on the throne. Now, Zerubbabel is very important in that. When you go down through the genealogy, when you go to Matthew chapter 1 and you see the genealogy of Jesus, and you go to the book of Luke and we get an additional genealogy of Jesus. We have two genealogies, and they're different. They both come through David, but one of them, the genealogy in Matthew, comes down through Solomon, the son of David. The genealogy in Luke comes down through Nathan, the son of David. So they split at David. But if you read both of those genealogies and compare them, they come back together at Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel. Then they split again. And they come back together at Jesus. Now, here in Chronicles, we go through Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is the one who would lead God's people back in order to rebuild the house of the Lord, to rebuild the temple of God. So the genealogy of Jesus splits, and it comes together in the one person who would rise up to lead the children of Israel back to rebuild the temple. And he would do that with his co-worker, Jeshua, which, as we talked about before, is the Hebrew name for Jesus. So then it splits again. And where does it come back? It comes back in Jesus, who would be the one who would lead God's faithful people and rebuild the temple of God, which is what we're part of today. And so, look at what God is doing with genealogies. Look at how he is forecasting. He's reassuring these people of a promise, but he's also showing us so many years later that he could forecast with the lives of real people. He's not just a great author like someone who might make up stories and make a mystery that he reveals later and can shock us all. God can write those sort of stories using real history as his paper and actual people as his ink. That is a sovereign God. Well, not only do we get a focus on the house of David, but as you turn a few pages, you see the other tribes being given their genealogies, which is important. But notice particularly we get focus, extended focus, on the house of Levi, and even more particularly on the various priestly lines. You know that I said earlier that there was one chapter where there were 81 verses of names. Those are the names of the priests. it's very important when they return to establish a temple that they would be able to identify who the priests were. So the names are recorded. In fact, over in the book of Ezra, that's one of the things that you see is that if people, that even Levites who came forward, if they could not establish their lineage, if they couldn't confirm that they were priests, they were not allowed. It's very important. And so it gives us a lengthy dissertation about them. It also tells us about these other tribes. Of course, that is important as they're coming back into the land and they're re-inheriting their portions of the land. It would be important to know who came from what tribe. And then, of course, even those who lived in Jerusalem, as they're re-inheriting their portions, that's given to us in that final chapter 9. All of those genealogies are important. And they're important for what Ezra and God's people need to do as they come back. Again, the line of David is the focus, not Saul. That's important because he's the one that the promise would come through, not Saul. We're not trying to reestablish the house of Saul. We're trying to reestablish the house of David. The covenant with David that we read at the beginning, I will build you a house, that is emphasized and it's repeated throughout. And again, for people who are hearing this after it's all gone to pot, it's been destroyed, that they would continue to hear that promise of I will build you a house. Why are you repeating this? Because the promise has not failed. It may look like it's failed, but it's not failed. And then, of course, the instructions for the organization of the temple are given in all this detail to those who would be taking up the very task of reorganizing the temple. Well, in the few moments that we have left, I want to make some applications and talk about why I'm calling this lesson the Restoration Movement. First of all, God always records things and they are preserved for us with a purpose. When you see 9 chapters of genealogies, the question you ought to be asking is, why on earth is that there? Some places it's very obvious why something is there, and some places it's not as obvious. And it requires more digging, and I think, in fact, we learn more when we start asking questions like, why is that there? The Restoration Movement, as it is known, that occurred in the 18th century, was a movement in which people looked around and said, none of these churches looked like the church in the Bible. And would it be possible for us to just open the New Testament and read about what the church looks like there and just worship like that? Would that be possible? Well, I think what 1 Chronicles says is not only is it possible, but God's done it before. When it was all wiped out, everything destroyed, what do? Well, you go back and you listen and reread about how it was done the first time. And see, that's what 1 Chronicles is. What did David do? What did he set in place? How did Solomon do it? And all the details are there. And let me just say, it's the details that they need and not the ones they don't need. Some people will criticize what we do. They'll say, oh, you're pouring through those letters of Paul and you're looking for details and you're trying to figure out how they did it. You're trying to, turn it into some pattern. And I just say, that's exactly what we're trying to do. And that's exactly what they were trying to do. But they were doing it at God's inspiration. And so what we're doing, we're not doing for the first time. We're not the first of God's people to look around and say, nobody's worshiping God like they should. Let's go back to when he instituted it and figure it out. And we can do it just like they did. That's what God said to these people. And even when we go and we pick out details and we say, here is an element, I'm going to take this verse right here, or this few verses right here, and somebody says, you're taking that out of context. I think certainly we don't want to take a verse or a set of verses out of the context in a way that it contradicts the context. But notice that the writer of 1 Chronicles has taken all sorts of pieces of the story. I'm not giving you the whole story. So if I was studying with somebody and I want to study baptism, I'm not going to study every verse in the Bible with them, but I want to study all the verses that talk about baptism. And then what we could do is we could get the story of what baptism is. and what it means and how it affects us. And somebody says, you're just looking for verses about church leadership. Well, if I'm studying church leadership, that's really the only verses I'm interested in at that moment. And so, I might grab some verses here and here. I want to try to get a full picture. What all does God's word say about this? How we use the Lord's money. I don't look at every verse, but every verse that talks about his church and money, I want all those verses. And I put them together and I get a picture of a pattern that we can follow. And so we're not doing something unique, not something that's different than the way God wants us to. In fact, he's shown us a picture of this happening in the book of First Chronicles. Well, a couple of other elements here. God is in charge, and he has not forgotten his promises. That is a difficulty. Would have been a difficulty for the people reading this, and so they're being reassured all throughout. In 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and in verse 25, in the midst of giving the genealogies there, these are the genealogies of Reuben. It says, they acted treacherously against the God of their fathers. Against the God of their fathers, and played the harlot after the gods of the people of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, even the spirit of Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and he carried them away into exile, namely the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, and brought them to Halah, Habor, Harah, and to the river of Gozan to this day. Now that doesn't sound like a very encouraging passage because it's talking about God's judgment. But can I suggest to you that this part, to a people who are coming back, and they're going to rebuild, and they're coming back in the face of judgment, it's still, fresh in their memories, to hear that even God's judgment was an assurance of his promises. When God judged his people, he didn't just all of a sudden say, you know what, I'm tired of you. No, he was standing by his promises. If you go back to the law, you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, for instance, or Leviticus chapter 26, or Deuteronomy 27 and 28, what you find in those chapters is God saying, if you do well, here is how I will bless you, and if you do not, here is how I will punish you. And when he took them away into captivity, all he was doing is what he said he would do. And to a people who have suffered God's judgment, to be reassured that you haven't just suffered some random judgment, but that you have been under the hand of a God who keeps his promises. Even judgment can be a reassurance in that way, because we can know who God is. We're not guessing. We know, because he's revealed himself in that way. Well, there's much more encouraging ways in which he continues to remind them that he has been and will continue to keep his promises. But the main point throughout all of this is whether it's the blessings of bringing them back or whether it is the discouragement of them taking away, constantly the writer in 1 Chronicles is saying God is doing what he said he would do. So people who are being taken away who might be saying, where is God? He's right there with the army of the Babylonians. And where is God now? He was right there with Cyrus and delivering that proclamation to you to bring you back. He's been there the whole time. God didn't abandon you. You abandoned him. But he didn't abandon you. His promises have been secure. The other thing to note there is that God is the point. He is central to all of this. The point is not to elevate his people for their own sakes. Over in chapter 13, 1 Chronicles 13, and in verse 6, here we have the story of the returning of the ark. And it says, David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is to Kiriath Jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, the Lord who is enthroned above the cherubim, where his name is called. It does that repeatedly as it refers to the ark. In other words, the idea, I think, is don't focus on the ark specifically. Focus on the one that the ark makes reference to. It's God who is there. And when you rebuild the temple, don't forget, when the temple was destroyed, Jeremiah talks about and Ezekiel talks about that the people would say, hey, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. We cannot be defeated. We have the temple of the Lord. And then the glory of the Lord departed. And what you had was a really fancy building that meant nothing. And God wiped it out. And they could rebuild that temple again. And they could do it by the pattern. They could do everything that they were supposed to do. But if they forget the point is that God is there, then they've missed everything. We can do the same thing. We can go find all the particulars and we can structure the church just like they did. And we can have the right leadership and we can spend the money in the right ways and we can partake of the Lord's Supper and we can say the 5 acts of salvation and the 5 acts of salvation. If all we're doing is following it at the surface level, then we've got a shell here and it doesn't mean anything. We got to remember that the point is God is here. And if we reestablish, if we restore New Testament worship, but do it in word only, then all we're doing is really setting ourselves up for the same sorts of failure that have come before. That's what they would do. They didn't learn the lesson. And they continue to ignore the most important element. And God would again finally bring destruction in the New Testament. Let us not fall into those same patterns as we try to restore New Testament worship today. Make God the center of that worship. Most religion tries to tell you today, you're the center of the story. You are awesome. God doesn't say, you are awesome. He says, I am. And any specialness we have is because he makes us special. He's the point. And so let's turn our focus towards him.
I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord